if your child has been receiving special education and related services, you're probably hearing the term LRE thrown around a little bit, so we're here to describe it for you.
Well, LRE stands for the least restrictive environment, and I find that there's a lot of confusion over this term, the least restrictive environment. What is the least restrictive environment? And Jen is going to start by giving some historical perspective of how the LRE came into being.
Right. So the reason we even have the federal IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is that in 1975, Congress passed this law. It was not called that then, but it's now called IDEA, that allowed students with disabilities the right to attend their public high schools, their public elementary schools, their public middle schools, which sadly, prior to that time, only 1975, there was no legal entitlement to do. And who fought for that law? Parents. Parents of children with disabilities fought for that law, as well as adults who had disabilities fought hard for that law. And the LRE provision, the least restrictive environment provision, is really the cornerstone of that entitlement. And what it's saying is that children who have disabilities, to the maximum extent appropriate, should be educated with children who do not have disabilities. We didn't want warehousing. We didn't want seclusion. And we still don't.
Happening.
Which is exactly what was happening. We wanted kids who have disabilities to be able to go to their local school and be successful there.
Right. And you know, when I was in junior high school, I will never forget that there was a very long corridor, and at the end of the corridor, the door said, the trainables. And sadly so, this is where children with special education needs were educated, and they very seldom came out of that room and were included with the other children. And so the emphasis in the 70s or after the 70s was to say, these children need to be educated to the maximum extent possible, and that's appropriate, with typically developing peers. Right. However, having said that, I think the least restrictive environment often gets confused with, well, the law says you must be educated with typically developing children, and then you hear the term inclusion is the law. Right. But in fact, inclusion is not. The term inclusion is not in the IDEA or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So in other words, what is restrictive for one child may not be restrictive for another. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a 15-year-old student who has an autism spectrum disorder and is completely nonverbal, cannot read, cannot write, and basically has needs to learn functional skills. Right. Can you imagine that child being in a typical 11th grade, 10th grade classroom where they're in with all the other peers, but they're receiving no meaningful educational benefit by being in that high school classroom setting?
Well, and this is why LRE is as tied to individualized programming as any other aspect of the federal law. The individual needs, the unique needs of the individual child are always paramount. And so the language says the least restrictive environment appropriate to meet that child's needs. The IEP always has to offer an appropriate program. So for one child, what might be appropriate is an incredibly restrictive program, as you're describing. Right. For another child, what might be appropriate is basically a mainstream program with maybe a half an hour a week of counseling support and some special education instruction. It depends on the kid. And the IDEA envisions a continuum of appropriate alternative placements. And that continuum goes from very restrictive, including hospital placements, to very, very mainstream programs, less restrictive programming right within the neighborhood school that you would attend if you did not have a disability. And it depends on the individual needs of the child. The inclusion problem that we're running into is that LRE is the mandate. Inclusion is an approach of how we include children with disabilities. Right. And, you know, it is a very difficult thing to do well. And what I find frustrating, and I know you do too, is the concept of what I would call inclusion by osmosis, where school districts will say, well, let's just put this kid in a classroom with a whole bunch of kids who do not have disabilities and pretend that we don't have to change the program in any other way and the child will benefit from being in that classroom. Well, there are ways in which one could benefit, but it has to be done well. It takes thought. It takes sometimes outside expertise. And so inclusion, that word isn't necessarily the legal term, but it's often used interchangeably with LRE, and it really isn't the same thing.
And regarding inclusion, I mean, I like to say that you can be in, but not with.
Right.
Okay, so just because you're sitting next to that typically developing child who's in regular education doesn't mean that you're benefiting in the same way that that student is. And back to the least restrictive environment continuum for a minute. The least restrictive environment is obviously to be in your public school, in your local neighborhood, full-time in the regular education classroom. Then a step down from that is perhaps the child has some push-in services by a related service provider, a speech and language pathologist, an occupational therapist.
So they come into the classroom.
They come into the classroom. Then maybe one step down on the continuum is that that child needs to be removed from the room, perhaps go to a resource room.
Right.
Then the next step down is maybe they spend a part of their day in a resource room and some part of their day in the regular education. And down it goes all the way to perhaps what is as restrictive as a hospital setting,
Right.
which might be appropriate for a particular person with a particular disability and for their individual needs. That's the least restrictive environment.
Well, and Julie, you hit on a word that is actually right in the language of the statute that is important, the word removal. And the whole point of LRE is that we shouldn't be removing kids from their public program that they would normally attend if they didn't. Ideally, unless the
Right.
school district has used every resource that they can, pretty much, to make sure that the child cannot be included appropriately in the mainstream. So removal should only occur if supplemental aids and resources cannot achieve inclusion satisfactorily. And what I see a lot is, and if you look at it from that historical civil rights perspective, that makes sense. You're not supposed to be pulling a kid from the program they would otherwise go to unless you've tried other measures and it's not working. What I see a lot of families struggle with is, I think my child needs a one-to-one paraprofessional in the mainstream in order to be successful there. The school district doesn't want to have to spend the resources to give the child the paraprofessional so that they can be in the mainstream, and therefore they pull the kid and put him all day in a self-contained classroom. That really doesn't meet the spirit of the IDA and certainly doesn't comply, in my view, with LRE unless they've made some effort to try that measure.
And if in fact you have that conversation where somebody says to you, well, the law is inclusion. Well, the law is an inclusion, and while we all would like to strive for inclusion, the child has to be appropriately included. Getting back to FAPE, free appropriate public education, there's that word appropriate again, which people can sometimes get into disagreement about. But I think the most important thing is to know the difference between inclusion and the least restrictive environment.